today's video we will be talking about the shock therapy in the post-communist regions. So basically we know that the Cold War, it was from the year 1945 to 1991. So after the 1991 the Cold War ended, and because of that there was a result, that is the end of bipolarity that we are studying. Here we are studying that after USSR was disintegrated, these post-communist regions, they faced with shock therapy. Now what is shock therapy? We will understand this in today's video. This is the exact answer that you need to write when a question comes on what is shock therapy. So the collapse of communism was followed in most of these countries. Now if you see the map of USSR, you will see that there is Russia, there is Central Asia, and some parts of Europe. So we are talking about these regions. Now in these regions there was the collapse of communism, because as the USSR disintegrated, so the ideology followed by USSR, that was communism, that was also collapsed. And after the collapse, these countries, they followed a painful process of transition. So there was the transition of what? From an authoritarian socialist system to a democratic capitalist one. So you need to remember the exact words in order to gain full marks. It was a painful process of transition from an authoritarian socialist system to a democratic capitalist system. And whole this model of transition, which was there in Russia, Central Asia and Europe, this was influenced by the World Bank and the IMF. So they kind of funded these countries in order to change from the socialist system to the capitalist one. So it was influenced by the World Bank and the IMF, and hence this came to be known as shock therapy. So when the question comes, what is shock therapy, define shock therapy, you just need to mention these words, at least the highlighted parts. So it was a painful, so collapse of communism was followed by most of these countries by a painful process of transition from an authoritarian socialist system to a democratic capitalist one. The model of transition in Russia, Central Asia and Europe, that was influenced by the World Bank and the IMF, came to be known as shock therapy. Now when we talk about that, this shock therapy, how was it actually being practiced? Now, each country which was part of the Soviet system had to make a total shift to the capitalist economy. So we will be mentioning few points that has to be there in an answer. First is rooting out completely any structures evolved. That means during the time period of the socialist system, so any structures, any institutions, whatever was evolved, we have to completely root them out. Alright, the second point is that the private ownership was the dominant pattern of ownership of property. So that means earlier there was what? Collective type of property system, but now the property has to be owned by the private individuals. So the private ownership became the dominant pattern of ownership of property. The third point is that the privatization of state assets and the corporate ownership patterns, they were immediately brought in. So all the state assets which was there, it was privatized, and there was corporate ownership patterns. Then the collective farming was replaced by the private farming plus the capitalism in agriculture. So within the agriculture also, capitalism was brought in, and the collective farming, so if farmers or they are doing farming in a collective manner, now this was abolished and there was a system of private farming. Then there was a drastic change in the external orientation of these economies, that is, the development was envisaged through trade. So there was sudden and complete switch to free trade, which was considered essential. Then the free trade regime and foreign direct investment were the main agencies of change. Third, it involved openness to foreign investment. So there was financial opening up or deregulation, currency convertibility. So you see, the external orientation of these economies was completely changed through trade, free trade, FDI, openness to foreign investment, financial opening up, deregulation, currency convertibility. So that is how the external orientation of the economy is changed. The last point is transition involved breakup from existing trade alliances among countries of the Soviet bloc. So there were different countries in the Soviet bloc, right? They had made several agreements within themselves. So when this was, there has to be the change here. So there was a transition where these alliances were broken. Now each state from the bloc had to be linked directly to the west and not to each other within the region that we talked about, and had to be gradually absorbed into the Western economic system, that is the capitalist system. In the Western capitalist states, the leaders basically they used to guide and control the development of the region. So the Western states were responsible to guide, to control the development of this whole region. That was all about your topic, which is shock therapy in the post-communist regions, where we talked about that how there was a transition from an authoritarian socialist system to a democratic capitalist system in Russia, Central Asia, Europe, which was influenced by the World Bank and IMF. And we talked about the major 6 points. So if a question comes in your exam, this is the exact way you have to write the answer. That's it. So 6 points: rooting out completely any structures evolved, then the private ownership which was the dominant pattern of ownership of property, then you have the privatization of state assets and corporate ownership patterns which were immediately brought in. Collective farming was replaced by private farming and capitalism in agriculture. Exchange in the external orientation of the economies, and a breakup from the existing trade alliances among the countries of the Soviet bloc. Lastly, I would like to remind you that this is just a one-shot revision video. This is not a detailed explanation of the topic. This is the video in which you are going to skim through the topic once before going to the examination, which will help you to retain the information for a longer period of time. So if you want a detailed explanation, there will be a separate video for that. Thank you.